Gentoo, NixOS, Devuan, Qubes, Linux from scratch. You know these names. You've seen them in threads. You've watched somebody drop one into an argument like a trump card and watched the argument end. And you have almost certainly never met a single person who uses any of them. That's the strange thing about the territory past Arch. It is the most discussed land in Linux, and it is basically empty. Later I'll give you the numbers, and they're worse than you'd guess. Because something changes once you go past Arch. Up to that point, every level gives you something. More control, newer software, more of your own hands on the machine. Past Arch, the levels stop giving. Every one is defined by something its people agreed to live without. And everyone will tell you, completely sincerely, that the thing they gave up was the good part. Gentoo, the hours. Gentoo compiles everything from source. Everyone repeats that, and almost nobody sits with what it means. On a mid-range 6-core desktop, Rust placed 58 minutes, LibreOffice 47, Firefox 37, and Firefox needs Rust. So a browser update is basically a 2-hour appointment. They even built a unit for this. It's called the SBU, Standard Build Unit, and it's based on how long your machine takes to compile bin utils. One time, on one core. Other build times are multiples of it. Sit with that. They invented a unit of time whose fundamental measure is compiling a thing. Now ask a Gentoo user why, and you'll get the answer they've been giving since 2004. It's faster. Built for my exact CPU. Optimized. The blanket claim doesn't hold up. Gentoo developers have said so. Michal Gorny was asked whether Gentoo is faster and essentially said no. Phoronix even benchmarked aggressive optimization against a normal build. The result came out slightly slower. And that's what makes Gentoo interesting. The reason people defend isn't really the reason people stay. The real reason is use flags. You decide what gets compiled into every package. Don't want pulse audio near your machine? It isn't disabled, it's absent. It was never built. And there's no company behind Gentoo, no business model, nobody's roadmap. Nobody owns this thing. They have a genuinely great argument and keep making the bad one because the bad one sounds like it's about the computer. Then Gentoo started shipping pre-compiled binaries, 20 gigabytes of them. LibreOffice, Plasma, GNOME, Docker, updated daily. Nobody was forced into anything. The option simply exists now. Which leaves a slightly awkward question. If you can avoid the compiling, were you ever really in it for the compiling? NixOS, the file. On NixOS, you don't install software. You describe the computer you want in a file, and the machine goes and becomes that. The file is the machine. Editing it is basically arguing with a photograph, and when it works, it produces one of the most seductive moments in Linux. You wipe a laptop, clone a Git repo, run one command. 90 minutes later, the machine is back. One person who did this said the detail that convinced him it had really worked wasn't uptime or disaster recovery. It was that his terminal opened with the correct font. That's what's being chased here. Not resilience, the feeling of a machine that remembers exactly who you are. Then come flakes, the feature underneath a huge amount of modern NixOS guidance. They're still officially experimental, years after becoming practically unavoidable in tutorials. So a newcomer's first act can be pasting in configuration they don't understand to enable a feature the project still doesn't promise to keep because the tutorial assumes they've already done it. And the documentation problem is real enough that the project's own docs team has publicly described users stitching answers together from multiple sources just to accomplish ordinary tasks. Eventually, the contradiction becomes obvious. You built an operating system around reproducibility and rollback, and then spend your weekend figuring out why the thing is broken, which is why NixOS is so seductive. When it works, the computer doesn't feel configured, it feels authored. The init war, the side. There's a level where you stop choosing an operating system and start choosing a side. In 2014, Debian made systemd its default init system. The veteran Unix admins forked over it and called the result Devuan. If you've only heard this fight as a punchline, the objection is more reasonable than the meme. Systemd stopped being just an init system. It absorbed networking, DNS, logging, home directory management, and more. And the fight keeps returning to the same question. Why is this part of the thing that starts my computer? They keep being capable of making the argument. They also keep losing. That is what makes this section different. We're no longer arguing about software. We're arguing about what kind of Linux person you are. And once you're arguing identity, facts become surprisingly difficult to use as an exit ramp. Qubes, 4 keystrokes. Qubes runs your life in separate virtual machines. Banking in one, work in another, random links in a third. They cannot see each other. The security model is compelling. Here's the bill. To move a password from one cube to another, copy it. Control plus Shift plus C. Click the other window. Control plus Shift plus V. Then Control plus V to actually paste it. 4 keystrokes across 2 security domains to move one password. The recommended hardware is also unusually specific, and some modern laptops simply don't fit the model. Suspend can fail badly. And yet users stay because the alternative is letting applications that should never trust each other touch the same machine. But the line that stays with you came from somebody who said Qubes taught him he had a lot of needs he eventually got rid of, which gave him more time for real life. That's an operating system so inconvenient it becomes a kind of monastic discipline, and he's grateful. Linux from Scratch, the book. Linux from Scratch is not a distro, it's a book. You follow it and, eventually, you have compiled an operating system from source, by hand, with no package manager and nobody else's defaults deciding what belongs on your machine. Someone who worked through it recently spent about 18 hours getting to a bootable system. And that's the deliverable. No desktop, no browser, no sound. Just Linux that boots. Making it useful is a separate, substantially larger project called Beyond Linux from Scratch. What he got out of the first book was real. He understood what every package on the system actually does and came away with a new respect for the people who maintain distributions. Then he said what he wanted to do next, work through the second book, so he could install i3. He built an operating system from source, and the reward he was excited about was a tiling window manager. Why you kept going? None of that answers the real question. Why would someone who already has a working computer do any of this? Not the technical justification. Every one of these has one. Why keep going after the problem is solved? I think the answer is dosage. Think about what Arch actually gave you, not features, the feeling. You picked the packages. You assembled the machine out of parts. And when it finally booted, you felt something no sealed product had ever made you feel. You built this. That feeling wears off. It has to. 2 years later, you haven't opened the config in 6 months. It's just a computer now. So you take more. Gentoo gives the feeling back by making you choose what's inside the packages. NixOS makes the whole machine a document you authored. Qubes turns it into vigilance. Linux from Scratch strips away almost everything until the authorship is pure. That's what these levels are, not capability. Escalating doses of authorship in a system that builds tolerance. And it explains the strangest part from the outside. People leave. A guy who ran Gentoo for 7 years wrote a goodbye post subtitled, "Is this what growing up feels like?" His reason wasn't that Gentoo got worse. He had started wanting to turn on his workstation and do work. Another NixOS user hit a firmware-related boot loop and discovered that the rollback philosophy is less comforting when the bootloader itself won't start. Neither of them lost an argument. The dose stopped working. The census. I said I'd give you the numbers. DistroWatch measures daily interest, not installs. So this is not a population count, but it gives us the scale. Mint pulls about 2,200 a day. Arch gets 640. NixOS, 521. Gentoo is 56th, 243. Slackware is 61st. Qubes is 91st. These aren't populations, they're landmarks. Everybody in Linux navigates by them, and almost nobody lives there. What they found out, which makes them easy to write off. I don't think that's fair, because the most useful thing about these communities is that they keep finding out where their own ideas break. Gentoo learned that compile time optimization doesn't magically make the machine faster. NixOS keeps discovering the limits of its configuration model. Qubes keeps discovering how much friction security can impose. Nobody outside these communities had to run the experiments. They did it to themselves, on the record, and left the results where everyone else could use them. That's the thing worth defending. These are the places where Linux tests its own ideas so the rest of us don't have to. Somebody has to spend 20 years compiling everything from source so we can learn that the machine wasn't waiting for that. Somebody has to describe an entire computer in a file so we can discover where that abstraction breaks. It's unpaid, largely thankless, and everyone benefits from it, including the people making fun of it. So if you've spent the last few minutes quietly costing out your weekend, none of this is a place you have to get to. Whatever these people are chasing, you've already had it. The moment the machine stopped being a sealed object and became a list of decisions somebody else made, decisions you were allowed to make differently, that happened the first time Linux booted on your hardware. And it does not get bigger than that. It only gets more expensive. Everything past Arch is people trying to feel it one more time, which is a far more human thing to be doing than compiling a web browser for 2 hours. And they'll be the first to tell you the browser isn't any faster.